everybody, and welcome as we begin our journey into the world of biology. I want you to take a look at this picture. We definitely see things that we consider to be alive in this picture. For example, we see the tree. We know that trees are alive. We see grass. We know grasses are alive. We see some kind of aquatic grasses here. They're a bit longer than the grass that we see over here, and those would be alive as well. And we also see a body of water, and we can probably assume that there are living things in the water as well. All of those things that we see are considered macroscopic forms of life. They're big enough for us to see with our eyes alone. But we also know that the other part of the biological universe is the things that we can't see with our naked eyes. Instead, we need special tools in order to see those things. And those far outnumber the things that we see macroscopically. So there's a lot more little things than there are big things. All of those things, however, are alive, and biology is the study of living things, or the study of life. So what happens if we want to find a pure textbook definition of life? Well, I found one for you, and here is what it looks like when I looked it up. There's at least 10 different ways to think about life. So you would have to go through each one of these, and you would have to figure which one sounds the best. Now, for our purposes, the first one is going to sound the best to us. So it says the state of being which begins with generation, birth, or germination, and ends with death. Also, the time during which this state continues. That state of an animal or plant in which all or any of its organs are capable of performing all or any of their functions, used of all animal and vegetable. That's pretty heavy duty. And if you read through the next 9, you're going to find that they are no easier to understand than the first one. Now, as good as the first one is, as much as it matches our purpose, there's some flaws in it. And one of the flaws that I see is the fact that it mentions particularly animal or plant. So what it's saying is, to be alive, something must be an animal or a plant. And if you look through your biology book, you're going to truly find that there are things in your biology book that are alive which would not be considered an animal or plant. And we will delve into that this semester. So then, there's no easy explanation of what exactly life is, but life is explained by what living things do. So here we see a wheel of pictures, all of which show living organisms displaying the characteristics of life. And the first thing we can kind of knock out right off the bat here is that living things, when we refer to them as whole entities, we're going to call them organisms. Okay? No surprises there. You've heard this word before, and we'll be referring to it quite often during this class. If we take a look at the first picture, the one marked number 1, we can see that it's the center of a flower. And that flower is displaying order and organization. What that means is it's just not a random, chaotic mass of living material, but instead it's very organized, as you can see there. You can see that it has a central region here, and you see that there are definitely lines of distinction that exist within this centermost portion. So we have a round nature to the center. We have what we call radially symmetrical petals on the edges as well that all seem to be coming off of the central hub region. So this definitely is not a chaotic looking mass of organic chemicals that make up this living thing. They are organized very distinctly into unique structures. Now, we could say the same for a human being. A human being is not a big bag of goo on the inside. There are definite structures that have organization on the inside as well. Even when we're little children, we understand there's hard parts inside of us called bones. Even though we don't know what the rest is or what it looks like on the inside, we know that there's these hard structures called bones, and we try our best not to break them when we're little kids. So we must understand that there is a structure to living things, and that these structures themselves are not chaotic either. They themselves have more organization inside of them than a lot of people know. Let's take a look at some systems of the human body. So we see the muscular system on the left, we see the skeletal system, we see the nervous system in the middle, we see the endocrine system in the fourth picture, and we have the circulatory system, or it is the circulatory system. Cardiovascular, we'd have to see the lungs in there, and we don't. So the circulatory system is going to contain the vessels in which pass the fluids of life around inside of a living human being, which of course is blood. Now, if we take a closer look at the skeleton picture, we can see that the human skeleton is made up of a lot of bones, 206 of them. And those bones themselves, like I mentioned before, they have their own structure as well. So if we took a look at the interior of a portion of bone, we might see something like this. So what we see here is a very organized structure, has its own system of organization. This is called the Haversian system, or the osteon. And you can see that you have little blood vessels inside of each one of these circular cylinders. And you also see these concentric layers of rings on the outside. You see these little dotted structures on the inside. These are little cavities where cells exist, and what they do is they can contribute to bone making or bone taking. So they'll either add or remove bone from a given region of bone at any particular moment in time, depending on what the body needs at that time. We'll talk a lot more about the skeletal system when we learn about the human body later in our class. So we never stop seeing patterns of organization within living things. Now, we can even go as simple as a human cell, or really any eukaryotic cell, and this is what we're going to find on the inside. We're going to see what looks like it could be chaos, but the fact remains that in every single one of these animal cells, we see the same structures over and over and over. The three things that are always going to be present is the cell membrane, which you can see right here. We see the cytoplasmic region right here, which contains this soup full of organelles. And we see a nucleus here that has a nuclear envelope around it. So those key structures are always going to be present in animal cells. Now, things that are also present in animal cells are going to be organelles. And this is where you probably remember some of these names from your last class, like the Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, lysosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, also called ER, little protein building factories called ribosomes, and even a dark central spot in the nucleus called the nucleolus. All of these things are present in every animal cell. So this is a system of organization. It's a little bit more loosely organized than other structures, but we see the same pattern over and over and over, which means that it is a structure of organization. It is a unit of organization within living things. So the cell is then the basic structural and functional unit of all living things. So if you look into anything that we consider alive, you'll find one or more than one cell present, and you'll see sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes millions, and sometimes trillions of cells that work together to form possibly a tissue, possibly an organ system, or even an organism. Now, they are all produced from pre-existing cells. What does that mean? Well, it means that a cell cannot just spontaneously create itself out of nothing. Hundreds of years ago, people believed that things like maggots and little worms could come out of nothing and just spontaneously appear on things like grain and dead organisms. They also thought that mice could appear in grain stalks out of nothing. So they did all kinds of tests and research, and they were able to come to the conclusion that they were wrong, that it wasn't just coming out of nowhere, but instead each of those things, from a maggot to a worm to a mouse, they all had cellular origins. So there was an experiment that really helped this idea along. It was done by Louis Pasteur, and we're going to find out more about this experiment later, but using a special type of biological apparatus, he was able to prove that you cannot just spontaneously generate cells. Instead, it's going to require another cell to go ahead and divide to give you your next set of cells. Cells are also the smallest units that perform all the vital physiological functions. So from our last slide, you saw a whole wheel of pictures, and a cell can do all of those things because it can perform all the vital physiological functions or characteristics of life. Now, these three statements are actually very special because they are considered cell theory. Cell theory was originated by the scientists Schwann and Schleiden, and they are a big key part to the understanding of basic biology. If we look down below, we mentioned these earlier, that these are bacteria, and we know that every bacterium must come from another. You can't have these just come out of nowhere. So it's possible that this one here came from that one there. It grew to a certain size. Once it hit that size, it split in two by a process of binary fission. To the right of that, we have a simple one-celled organism here. This is a paramecium. We have a fungus here. We have a flower, part of the plant kingdom here. And here we have an animal. Organisms can just be one cell. So in this case, this one here and this one here represent living things that are just one cell big, and those are called unicellular organisms. Or it can be made of many cells, such as the case of the fungi, the plant, and the animal, and that's what we've called a multicellular organism. We are a multicellular organism as well. If we look at the levels of organization, we can start at a very small level, and we can start to see properties emerge as we go up every level. For example, at the bottom level on the right here, I see an atom. If you guys remember back to high school, you have atoms. And these atoms, when they find the right partners, they can change into molecules. And molecules do different things chemically than atoms do. Now, if I happen to put together a few million of the correct molecules, I may be able to form a cell, either an animal cell or a plant cell. And going from these millions of molecules that do not exhibit any of the properties of life, if I have the right ones there, I can form a life form here, and the simplest organism that can exhibit those properties of life that it couldn't as a molecule. If I put enough of these cells together of the same type, I may be able to form tissues. So this here would be an example of nervous tissue. The way that these cells are shaped tell me this comes from the nervous system. This particular plant cell here will become part of a leaf. And those little dark green things that you see in there are chloroplasts that allow it to photosynthesize. As we climb up the particular type of tissue and we put enough tissue together, we might form organs. So in this case, we see the brain. You can take a look up here. It's going to be the brain of an elephant. And again, this is a bigger cross-sectional piece of a leaf. And if we put organs together, we build a bunch of organs that are connected together, we can have an organ system, such as the nervous system in this elephant. Once enough systems are put together, you may be able to have an entire organism, a multicellular organism, which has a lot more properties than just a organ system or an organ, because we know that these don't do too well on their own without those other systems being present. So each time we move up a rung on this ladder, we start to see new emergent properties come out. Let me catch up with some of the labels for each one. I forgot to pop these up. We have the atomic level, the molecular level, the cellular level, tissue level, organ system level, and then finally the organism level. Now you can see that the pictures go further, because once you put a number of the same species together, you then go from a single solitary organism to a population of organisms. And once you put a number of populations together of different species, so here we see zebra, here we see those trees, here we see elephants, we then have what's called a community that lives and interacts together. And those interacting communities can form an ecosystem with the rest of the environmental things that are around it. So this would be a much larger area here to qualify as an ecosystem. So we take into consideration some of the abiotic factors that exist here as well, such as water, such as the wind, such as the amount of sun, the soil, the rocks that are present. And then finally, all the living things on the planet are going to interact in the biosphere. So we can't truly separate one ecosystem from another on a line, on a map with a line. It's just too difficult. There's a lot of blending that goes on. And all the things that are alive share this this planet Earth and make up the biosphere. Okay, so we've touched upon organization. We know that living things maintain order and they're organized. 2, living things adapt. Now, adapting may mean that something is physically changing or possibly behaviorally changing. Now, what would be the best example? The best thing we could do is take a look at an animal and talk about what physical and behavioral adaptations it may have. So here we have an owl, and the owl has a number of physical adaptations that's going to help it survive. All of these adaptations are going to make an organism better suited to its environment to survive and pass on its genes to the next generation. So the first thing that we could say is that it has talons. We can all see that it has these claws coming out of its feet here, and these are very strong claws. In fact, they kill most of their prey with those claws alone. And the owls are said to have some of the strongest gripping strength of any of the raptors, of any of the birds of prey. It's kind of hard to tell, but owls usually have very large eyes in proportion to the rest of their body as well, which give them great vision, and especially nocturnal vision because they wind up doing most of their hunting at night. So inside the eyes, we have 2 types of cells called rods and cones, and rods are super sensitive to light, and so an owl's eyes have a lot more rods relative to, say, a human's, because we do most of our things diurnally throughout the day. Some other adaptations. We know that an owl's head can twist around to some severe angles, almost 270 degrees in every direction. Also, owls have a special set of feathers here that give it silent flight. So these feathers that are found on the wings, when an owl flaps them, you don't hear the owl. So it's very stealthily goes after its prey. Consider that with a regular bird that flaps its wings and you can hear it coming from feet away. So an owl's an ambush hunter. So those are all physical adaptations. Well, what about behavioral? What does this owl do behaviorally that allows it to survive better? Well, one of the things that it does, it only hunts during the night. Why would that matter? Well, if you think about the other things that hunt during the day that are raptors or birds of prey, we have things like bald eagles, we have things like hawks. Maybe to decrease the competition amongst these birds, it chooses nighttime because its body is better suited to that. And that had to take place over thousands upon thousands of years to have the 2 of them work harmoniously like that. But it was a winning strategy because we know that there are owls present at night, and we know that there's hawks and eagles that are present hunting throughout the day. Another thing that these owls will do is they will perch very high on posts, and they will watch, and they're very keen on sensing moving things out in the field that they're watching. Once they sense something has moved, they'll go ahead and they'll do a particular type of flight pattern where they kind of just soar quietly back and forth over a field looking for that disturbance that they saw. So that behavioral adaptation will allow them to be more efficient hunters as well. So physically and behaviorally, the owl makes a great study for adaptations. This forms the foundation of the understanding of evolution, the process by which populations become more suited to their environments over time. So, as environments change, animals also change as well. Populations will take on new traits that may or may not work towards its benefit. Charles Darwin used the phrase natural selection to explain that certain traits allow for an individual to be better suited to its environment and thereby able to pass on its genes to future generations. The passing of genes and traits to offspring is referred to as heredity. So, the best suited individuals to a particular environment are going to survive and live on to reproduce and generate that next generation, and it will continue to do so until it doesn't have the necessary adaptations to survive. If something doesn't have an adaptation, the chances for it reaching reproductive age are much lower, and successfully producing offspring is much lower than it would be if it had the adaptation. So try to think of the phrase differential reproductive success. Some things successfully reproduce very well, some animals, and some do not. The ones that do will continue their genetic line to the next generation. The ones that have very low reproductive success will probably wean out over time and will go extinct. Here we have a scenario of a deer whose favorite food is a particular type of shrub that has leaves that look like these. Now, we're going to make believe that some mutation happened and it caused the leaves to come out with this kind of spiky, unpalatable surface that the deer just does not like to eat because it hurts its tongue when it bites into one of these leaves. So what's going to happen here is the deer is going to continue to eat its normal meal, which is this non-spiky type of leaf here. And it's going to try to dodge this one. It doesn't want to eat this one very much. So upon eating these leaves, it's also going to eat some of the reproductive structures that wind up budding off of the particular shrub. And in doing so, it gives the shrub less of a chance to plant seeds in other locations for more of this plant to come out. So by the deer eating what it normally does, it's decreasing the fecundity of this particular type of shrub, so its ability to reproduce successfully. So what that means is if it's avoiding this particular spiky leaf, the spiky leaf has no problem reproducing in other areas. So you're going to start to see more and more spiky leaf plants, and meanwhile the number of deer hasn't caught up to the fact that it's losing its food source, because now we only have half of the regular shaped leaves available for this particular deer. And as we can see, he hasn't changed his eating habits at all. It's still the smooth edged leaf versus the spiky one. And as the number of deer increase and the smooth leaf becomes a limiting resource, a couple things are going to have to happen. Either the deer is going to have to change what he normally eats, adapt behaviorally, or the other option is die. Because if it can't eat this particular type of food that it's currently eating, it may not have enough nutrition in order to maintain enough calories to survive. So here we see almost, we're talking 80 to 90% of its original food source is gone. It hasn't yet developed the ability to withstand eating this spiky one. So the question is, will this deer adapt or die? Now, when we talk about Darwin's view on natural selection, we say that some species are selected for and some species are selected against. Now, the question is, who is selected for here and who is selected against? Well, as we can see, the deer, by not changing its food source, means that it is going to be selected against in this interaction. The prickly leaf subspecies that came from a mutation is selected for in this interaction. If the deer move on and over time give this particular plant a chance to grow back and to repopulate, that may happen, and the deer might be fine if they find a new foraging ground. However, if it doesn't, and this stays its only food possibility, it may die if that food source runs out. So in the case of who's adapting here, the shrub actually adapted by way of a mechanism of a mutation. So it worked out positively this time for the shrub. The third characteristic of life we're going to look at is that organisms respond to their environments. And in this situation here, we see that a damselfly has been attracted to a Venus flytrap. Possibly the coloration of the Venus flytrap, the chemicals that are present, drew this damselfly in for a possible meal. And the damselfly happened to trigger a couple of trigger hairs that are present on the Venus flytrap here and here. It struck them with its feet, and striking those two trigger hairs at a certain tempo allowed the Venus flytrap to use that as a stimulus to close its jaws on this damselfly. And now the Venus flytrap has responded to its environment, and now it has a meal. So it grew this structure because it has to obtain its nitrogen not through the soil, because the soil that a Venus flytrap lives in is very pore. So it obtains this nitrogen through eating live animals, in this case a damselfly. So each one responded to its environment, and it did so in order to successfully survive that particular environment. Now, responding to the environment is a very, very important thing, and we do so as well. For example, just taking a quick peek over here, this hiker, if the temperature decreased and we were close to home, we'd run back home and we put on new clothing because the environmental conditions have changed. So we're going to respond to that. In this case here, we'll say that this hiker wasn't close to home. In fact, she was very far from home, and she was caught without the proper clothing in an area she shouldn't have been in on that particular day. So what her body is going to do is going to try to prevent it from dying by using an internal response mechanism. Her body wants to maintain a steady state. It doesn't want to decrease in temperature, because if it does, she may become hypothermic, and that could lead to her demise. So what's going to happen is that those cold temperatures are going to reach her skin, and they're going to trigger, as a stimulus, particular nervous cell stimulations. Their message is going to be transferred from the skin, from these temperature receptors, down these sensory nerve fibers here, and it's going to travel all the way up to this person's brain, and it's going to reach a particular little tiny structure in the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is like a thermostat on your house. So there's a set point value, and if you live in Michigan, we know that we have cold winters, and we set our thermostat at a certain heat level that we're comfortable with. If the temp dips down below that particular temperature, what's going to happen is that's going to trigger, by way of a stimulus, the furnace to kick on, and the heat's going to blow out until the ambient room temperature is above that particular temp that you set it at. And that will be a trigger to shut it off at that point, because we don't want it to run endlessly. So what's going to happen is the furnace of our body is going to be a correction signal that's going to go to our muscles, and it's going to cause them to start shivering. And it's doing that so we build heat. And the blood's going to be diverted to our core, we're going to start shivering, and that's going to generate some heat on the inside. Maybe enough to get her to somewhere safe again. So it's going to try to bring it back to a steady state, 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees. And if she cannot maintain that, and her body is working too hard, and it dips underneath that 98.6, she may go hypothermic, which would be a bad case, worst case scenario for her. And we have a name for that. We have a name for your body, or an animal's body, trying to maintain a steady state on the inside, and that's called homeostasis. We're going to look a lot into this concept this year. And the particular loop that you see here, a loop from stimulus to sensing it, to integrating the message to an effector, that loop is going to be called a feedback loop. And this one in particular is called a negative feedback loop because it brings the system back to a steady state. Now, inside our bodies, aside from temperature, we also have a whole bunch of complex chemistry going on as well. And in chemistry, we know that we deal with reactants and we deal with products. And we have to have a very specific amount of each one. If you go over too much, bad things can happen. If you don't have enough, bad things can happen. So internally, it helps us if we're able to maintain a steady state as well. And through a negative feedback loop, we can see that happen also. So take a look over here, and we can see that we have a reactant. So this might be something you ate. We'll call it A. And this A, food substrate, can be changed to B because we know that food leaves us in a different form than when we first ingested it. So it's going to go through a number of changes. And enzymes are going to provide a lot of those changes that we see. In this case, enzyme 1 is going to change substance A into substance B. Well, substance B is going to be changed to substance C by way of enzyme 2. And substance C is going to change into substance D by enzyme 3. So those three enzymes are necessary to change our food, our nutrition from A to D, whatever that may be, at a later time. But once we have enough D present, we have an internal mechanism that allows us to shut down this change because we don't need any more product D. So once you have an excess of D, it's going to send a signal to enzyme 1 to shut down. And if enzyme 1 shuts down, that means we're all topped off. We don't need any more of that particular chemical. So then A will probably pass through us at that point. We also have another system in play called a positive feedback loop, which is kind of the opposite. It doesn't bring things back to a steady state. Instead, it amplifies a change. It makes more happen. So in this case here, we have substance W, which changes to X at a later time, which changes to Y, which changes to Z. All of these changes are being helped by enzyme 4, 5, and 6. All of them are on in order for this to happen. But in this scenario here, when Z is made, a large amount of Z doesn't shut it down. Instead, you can see this plus here, it's going to cause more of it to happen. So what's happening now is that enzyme 5 has been supercharged, or maybe more enzymes have been produced to handle more W and eventually change it to Z. So in certain scenarios in organisms, you may want a positive feedback loop amplifying a particular change. What are some examples of that? Well, if you think about childbirth. For childbirth, once the birthing process has occurred, it helps the female body to push out that offspring, that organism, with stronger and stronger contractions from the uterus, if we're talking about mammalian animals. So as the uterine muscles are stretched, it's going to stimulate a stronger response, a stronger contraction of uterine muscles to expel the baby. So in that case, positive feedback works very well during particular processes, one being childbirth. One additional aspect when thinking about living things responding to their environment is the fact that they exchange matter and energy with their immediate environment. So whether it's a Venus flytrap exchanging matter with the food that it's caught, or this animal here that's enjoying a leafy meal, matter will be transferred to the other species, and energy will come with that matter. When animals release waste, that waste can be converted from waste to nutrients for growing plant matter as well. This past summer, we saw a flower bloom called the corpse flower. This flower is held in a botanical garden in England, and the key interesting trait about this flower is that it smells like a dead, rotting carcass when it blooms. Now, what evolutionary adaptation would that serve? How would this benefit this flower? Well, here's the thing. These flowers tend to be solitary. There's not many around. So when it blooms, it's going to need a means to carry its pollen to another plant in order to fertilize it. So this one does so by smelling, releasing chemicals that smell like a dead carcass, which draws in flies, of course. And the flies are going to feed on this blooming flower, and as they do so, they're gaining nutrients. But there is also matter being transferred. The pollen from this plant is being transferred to the flies, which may land on another flower, which will work to cross-pollinate that other flower. So there is an exchange going on between matter and energy by this particular flower by smelling like a corpse, and that's where it gets the common name corpse flower. Another type of Great Lakes example of exchanging matter and energy and responding to the environment, we can look at an invasive species called the sea lamprey. Now, the sea lamprey, as you can see, is not the fish, but instead it is this guy right here. And what this guy does is he's going to latch onto the fish, and he's going to chew a hole through the side of the fish, and it's going to extract matter, which it's going to use for its own energy stores for as long as possible. How does something like that attach to a fish? Well, it's kind of medieval looking here and pretty brutal, But basically, there's a suction disc on the front of this animal right here. You can clearly see it, and it has a number of rows of teeth as well. And these teeth are going to help to kind of lock in on the side of the fish's tissue. It has what's called a rasping tongue in here, which is going to bore a hole into the side of the fish, and it's going to extract nutrients from the fish. Does it hurt the fish? Of course. This is a parasite, so eventually it's going to weaken this fish so much the fish may die from the wounds that it's going to take on from the lampreys latching on to it. Now, how does a fish like this get into the Great Lakes? Well, this one has almost a 70 to 80 year history of entering the Great Lakes, and when it found the whitefish population of the Great Lakes, it found a great prey species in order to attach to, and then further its own life by doing that particular act of latching on, boring a hole and sucking out the nutrients. Now, of course, this is problematic because a lot of people were relying on the Great Lakes to be productive, and these big, large fish could feed a lot of individuals. So we had to look into control mechanisms. Now, one thing that we studied was the fact that when these lamprey die, they release a chemical which the other lamprey seem to acknowledge. They seem to sense this death chemical released when lamprey die, and they respond to it by getting as far away from it as possible. So I want you to think of this scenario. We'll think of a horror movie. You're out in the middle of the woods, absolutely in the middle of nowhere, and you're afraid because you're lost, and you start coming upon spikes with skulls on the tops of them. And you wander around, and the more you wander around, the more skulls on spikes that you see. Now, as a human, you're probably going to have the fight or flight response kick in. And you're going to try to get as far away from that threat as possible because you feel like your skull might be the next one on a spike. So these lamprey are kind of the same way. Our sense is sight. We see those things, we respond. Their sense is through chemicals in the water. They're able to smell these particular death chemicals released when a lamprey dies and get out of that area because they have evolved this particular adaptation to keep them safe. So we're going to watch a little clip here on what happens when a lamprey senses this death chemical. This is a study from Michigan State. They were looking at the sea lamprey, and they were trying to determine whether there were some control methods that they could put into play to keep the population of sea lamprey down. Because the higher the population is of this particular cartilaginous fish, the more damage they're going to do to our native sport fish that we have here in the Great Lakes region. So by looking at a chemical that can cause sea lamprey to move out of a given area, it may be possible to trap them in a given area and use a lampricide or possibly trapping methods to catch these sea lamprey so there's not so many of them swimming around in the Great Lakes region. So what we're going to see here is a researcher who's adding this chemical to this tank, and you can see at the bottom corner of the tank here a lot of sea lamprey that are just kind of hanging out. They're going to put this chemical inside the water, and we're going to watch and see what happens. So, as you can see, this is a pretty extreme response to its environment. It's sensing that there's death in the area, and each individual animal here, of course, does not want to die. It wants to extend its life as long as possible and reproduce as well. So in order to do that, what we see happening is we see a flight response. It's getting as far away from the possibility of being around this death of lamprey as possible. Some other remarkable types of responding to the environment. One is called a walrus haul-out. And we're keeping an eye on walrus haul-outs because of climate change. And as we know, as climate changes, one of the regions that's affected the most is the polar region. And what we're seeing is a dramatic decrease in the ice amount in those polar regions. Ice that's very, very important to some of the animals that live in those polar regions, such as the walrus. So I want you to take a look at this picture here. And you can see a couple of masses. I'll put my walrus picture up there. What this is here, we know what this is, but what we can see here are thousands upon thousands of walrus that have hauled themselves out of the ocean because there's no sea ice left. Now, females will bear their young on floating ice because it's much safer. They're closer to the food and they're safe from being trampled. So you can imagine a baby walrus in this situation. If there's something that causes a stampede, they're likely to get crushed under the weight of stampeding walrus. And we're starting to see a decline in their numbers as well, as they have to haul out early and young have to be tended to in these massive groups here. You see a much lower incidence of survival for the infants. Very low if the infant has to be born in these conditions here. Another one that we look at carefully, also from the polar region, are the fact that polar bears have been invading land lately. And the reason is because their ice is also going away in the same manner. And they need the ice to properly hunt because their main food is seal, and they're able to stealthily hunt the seal by way of the ice. But if there's no ice, they cannot even come close to catching one in the water, and they're at a loss, so they come to the land in order to derive the nutrition that they're missing. And that's what I mean by polar bear invasions. Now, a female polar bear must have enough fat, must take in enough calories in order to produce milk. And in the case here, if she's not receiving that kind of nutrition, it will result in a higher infant mortality, which basically means that her polar bear cubs starve to death, which is very sad. Avian migrations. We use the word avian as we represent birds. And for example, in Michigan, we have a lot of species that do migrate because they can't handle a Michigan winter, so they fly south for the summer. What we're seeing is that they're returning to Michigan much, much earlier, and they're leaving much, much later. So if there's some particular insect that they need throughout the yearly changes they go through in one place and not the other, they may miss that food web if they change their travel schedule. If they fly up north earlier and they leave later, what if there's a particular type of insect that gives their babies good nutrition, but it's no longer there? We have to remember that every animal is part of a food web. It's an essential piece of a food web, and without them being there, what happens is they may wind up dying, or the insect, for some reason, being there in too great of numbers changes the way that particular food web operates. The last example I'll mention is coral reef bleaching. And as we know, a coral reef is usually a beautiful, colorful thing full of a huge diversity of animals. And what can happen if the environment changes, such as a warm swell of water for 2 to 3 days, is we will see that beautiful coral reef full of color change to that, ghost white. Now, this ghost white coral reef has the ability to stay like this for a very short time, 2 to 3 days max. If the temperature remains high, this ghost white coral reef will then turn murky brown and green because it will all die and it will start decomposing. But if the cold swell can come back and relieve that heat pressure that it's under, it can actually revert back to the colorful, productive niche that it once was. What we're seeing with the environmental changes that are happening is that we're having a huge amount of species loss, greater than anything we've ever seen before. There is a natural background extinction rate to animals on this planet, but recently we've taken a look at it and we found that it is 1,000 times greater now than its background rate is, which means there's something very, very different going on in this world around us right now. Sometimes adaptations can counter rapid change, and sometimes not. If an animal has an inability to change to that environment changing, it may die or go extinct. So we've covered maintaining order, organization, adaptations, responding to the environment. We can also take a look at reproduction. We'll look at it much greater in depth later, but when we reproduce, we do so to produce offspring. So we have two members of the same species come together, and the male fertilizes the female in most cases, and what we'll see happening is offspring will be produced, and that will continue the genetic line of that particular animal. We can also see development over time. So development depends on the organism as far as how much you want to look into development. Some go through a number of stages. Think a frog. Think of the stages that a frog has to go through from egg to tadpole to juvenile and then to adult. Think of an insect, the instars that it has to go through from an egg to a larva to mature insect. So if we looked at a single cell organism, you might not see too much development, but what you will see is a gain in size, possibly a difference in the chemistry of that particular organism from just being made to, in its last stages. The chemistry might change a little. So there is development. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. Acquiring energy, utilization, and process. What that means is that animals must eat. They have to do something to regenerate their stores of ATP and have enough energy to go through and perform those characteristics of life that you see on this wheel. And lastly, number 7, which is actually pretty closely related to responding to the environment here. These two, there's a direct link there. We have an internal steady state with our metabolism, and we must be able to maintain that steady state in order to remain healthy. From everything from blood pH to temperature to number of specific ions present in our blood plasma, all of that's very important. So we must maintain our homeostasis. Now, so can we look at anything and determine whether or not it is alive or not, whether it's a living organism? Sure. We could take a look at a rock, for example. If I had a rock, does a rock maintain organization and order? Sure. Does it adapt? Not really. Does it respond to its environment? No. Reproduce? No. Develop? No. Acquire energy? Not usually. And maintain homeostasis? Not really, but kind of, sort of. So a rock wouldn't be good. What about fire? Fire is interesting because fire has a number of things that it might be able to do. Does it adapt to a situation? Maybe. It may have windy conditions or very still conditions, so it has to adapt in the way it burns. Does it respond to its environment? A little bit. Does it reproduce? It can, if a spark jumps off from the fire and lands on something else that's flammable. Does it develop? Yeah. Does it acquire energy? Sure, as it burns. Does it maintain homeostasis? It has a hard time doing that. It's not very good at it. And the key one that it's missing, although it worked for like 2 through 6, 7 and 1, maintaining order and organization, a definite no for fire. So that one would not work. But then we could take a look at anything else, and we'll see if all 7 of these come into play with the way it exists. And if it doesn't, then we can't go ahead and call it something that's alive. Another thing that we do find with things that are alive is they contain carbon. Carbon is the chemical that we use to label something as organic, and things that are alive are organic. Can we organize living things? Well, we definitely try. We use a branch of biology called taxonomy to put organisms into groups and categories. And there's 8 major taxa that organisms are classified into. And they go like this: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, how do you remember those in order? Well, there's mnemonic devices out there to help you with that. I would suggest Googling one. I'll give you one in class, and I'm sure you can find something to your liking that will help you remember the order of those. Now, the domain is the largest category that we see in taxonomy, and the smallest category is species. So domain's the biggest, and species is the smallest. So domains have tons and tons of organisms inside of them. Species only have 1. Every species we have, not only does it have labels that go in each one of these particular taxa, but if we're naming an organism, we tend to use just 2 parts of this. We use the genus and the species, which we call binomial nomenclature, a 2-part name. The first part that we use is the genus. The second part is the specific epithet, or we call it the species name. And we just say those 2 things when we represent an organism. They're also italicized. So if we think of a human being, we know that it's a Homo sapien. We would just write capital H-O-M-O and then sapien in lowercase.
Homo sapiens. And then if you've mentioned it once, no, sorry, it looks like an A. It should be an H. If you mention it one time and you have to refer to it again, you can just put the first letter of the genus followed by the species name. And that's good enough. Now, if we take a look at our howling wolf down here, we can see that it also has at least one name in each of these categories. But if we were referring to the wolf, we wouldn't need to use them all. For example, the domain that it finds itself in is Eukarya, its kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora, family Canidae, genus Canis, species Lupus. So the only thing we would use is the Canis part and the Lupus part here. And we would write that Canis with a capital C, Lupus with a lowercase l. Like I mentioned before, the domain being the largest taxon in this group means that it's the most inclusive taxa. It has a bunch of kingdoms under it, a bunch of phylums, a bunch of classes, orders, family, genus, and species. So it is the most inclusive taxa. The least inclusive is just the species itself right here. So if you were thinking which one's bigger and which one's smaller, there you go. The organisms are found in domains, that first category, and we have three major domains. So one thing I got to throw out there is the fact that taxonomy changes with time and research. About 20 years ago, when I was in high school, there were 5 kingdoms. That's how we learned about biology. But now we've learned through DNA testing is that there's 3 bacteria: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. And the 5 kingdoms are no more. They've changed it because the technology has changed and produced better results. So of the 2 things that make up the prokaryotes, we have bacteria and we have archaea. Very similar in structure and lifestyle, and we'll deal a lot more with those 2 particulars a little bit later in the semester. The eukarya include all eukaryotic organisms. And there's some key differences between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, again, which we'll talk about later. But this now has 3 kingdoms under its umbrella. It has fungi, it has plantae, and animalia. Well, what happened to the kingdom of Protists? Kingdom Protista. It's gone. Okay? Because they found through DNA and RNA testing is that the protists, the wide world of protists, many of them were more like fungi, some were like plantae, and some were like animals more than they were like each other. So in that way, we've now been changing the former protist kingdom into new members of the kingdom fungi, plantae, and animalia. I want to finish this talk with a discussion about what biologists do. We all have a picture in our head of what a biologist is or looks like or does on a daily basis, but I want to show you that there is a huge variety, huge diversity of occupational possibilities out there that biologists do on a day-to-day basis. So let's start with the simplest one, which is just research. Biologists are out there looking at things that they observe and studying them and then gaining a new body of knowledge which they can pass on to others. So research is in play. It always has been since organized thought about science has come into view of the public. We also have education. Educational biologists tend to share what they know with students, which is what I chose to do with you. We also have healthcare. So not only do we have veterinarians who treat animals and work with animals, but if you think about any healthcare professional around you, if you really look down at what they know about biology. So physicians, they know the biology of the human body. Dentists, nurses, and many other healthcare professionals are sharing and applying their knowledge of biology. It just happens to be in a healthcare setting. Environmental management and conservation. Of course, we want to preserve the natural areas around us on the planet, and we don't want to, pave over everything that's natural and change the way that our Earth works. There's value to conservation, and there's value to treating animals with respect. So, in terms of environmental management and conservation, these are jobs that exist. They're people that do them every single day, and they work to keep our Earth a healthier Earth. Biotechnology at the turn of the century was really exploding with the Human Genome Project, which was mapping out all of the DNA that a Homo sapien, a human being, has stored in every single one of their 30 trillion cells. That is a project that is thoroughly embedded in biotechnology. So not only do they do things like decode the human genome, but as you can see, they aid in advances of agriculture, food science, and medicine. They apply what they know using technology to make our lives better. These 5 things here are pretty traditional. But let's take a look at the now of biology and see what else is out there besides these jobs. So let's start with politics and policy. Science advisors work with lawmakers to create new legislation on topics such as biomedical research and environmental protection. So there's, of course, strong feelings on both sides of those two issues, biomedical research and environmental protection. So you have to have scientists working with legislators in order to push through some sensible and hopefully progressive information and choices that will better our society. Economics. Of course, many states rely on their natural areas as an aid in their financial well-being. Our state is one of them. So we have a huge amount of people come to our state to visit our Great Lakes and to take part in the wonderful natural areas that we have around our state. Mathematics. The Human Genome Project, without mathematics, could have never been accomplished. So all of the gene sequencing that has been done with the human genome took a great deal of math in order to accomplish that feat. So even though a lot of people take biology because there's not that much math in it, if you really get into some biology, you will see that math is present, it is there, and it's embedded into the science that we do. Business and industry. Of course, biologists are going to work with drug and science product companies with their testing, sales, marketing, and public relations that they have. Forensic science is utilizing science to help you with any types of investigations that deal with the law, processing evidence, solving crimes. That's all a part of forensic science. And yes, it does exist in the biological world. Every poaching incident is a potential forensic science crime scene, and it's dealt with in the same manner as a regular human-based crime scene. Science writing and communication, and every major publication that puts out some kind of article based on science. You're going to have someone who can communicate science well, put it into words and on paper, so that average people who haven't taken a science pathway in life may be able to understand the science that's being discussed. And lastly, even art has a place under the biology umbrella. Great artists can bring pictures of biology to life. They can allow us to see things that are hard to imagine in great clarity. So you have all of these diverse areas that are under the umbrella of biology that many people don't typically think of firsthand when they think of the world of biology. So I hope this opens up your view as well. I hope you were able to understand some of the basics of biology. By no means is it a full everything about biology. In fact, it's the opposite of that. We just scratched the surface of many topics to come this semester. So if you take some information with you and you're able to merge that with what you learned from your book, hopefully it will be more of an effective means to understanding material that's tough to grasp. When I mention the book, understand that your book is the glue that glues together all of these slides in this talk that I've done. Your book has to be a key part of how you learn biology. If someone was to watch this lecture, they might look at it as a disconnected bunch of slides that make no sense. There's no order or structure to them. But by having a book, the book will provide the glue where one part can then flow into another part, and you'll see some of the same ideas reviewed again, just happened to be on paper, and it might put everything together for a better understanding. So I hope to make more of these in the future. I'm doing this so you have something to go back and look at. Maybe you missed some things during the first lecture. Maybe you forgot some of the slides and what was on them. So I'm doing this for you. Hopefully we can keep doing this into the future, and you can use it to your benefit as an aid to your biology learning experience. So I'll see you next time.